Hello, and a warm welcome to everyone who's tuning in for our special live stream today. I'm your host, Sejal Thacker, and today we're going behind the scenes into the world of venture studios. And today's discussion was really sparked by a post I saw on LinkedIn. It was thought-provoking. It was a LinkedIn post by Matthew Burris. And his post really not only piqued my interest, but really ignited this idea. And so I was talking to Mark, and I said, hey, I want to ask you some of these questions that Matthew had put down in his post, because I think some of the people that tune into this would appreciate from it. So welcome back to the show, Mark.
Thanks, Angel.
I was telling you, this is my lucky week. Clearly, the stars are aligned in my favor this week. I got the pleasure of having a few digital interactions with you on WhatsApp, on LinkedIn, on live stream, on Google Meet, and I got to see you in person. This is like the week of Mark McNally jackpot.
I feel the same way. So I think the stars aligned for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was great seeing you in person. I really, as much as I love doing the virtual connections, I really love the in-person stuff. Like that's really where you get to feel the energy and really get to connect in person. We definitely need to do that more.
Of course.
So a quick shout out to Matthew Burris. Again, he's out there. He's an expert in helping to build, launch, and scale venture studios. He's doing some amazing work. So I reached out to him because obviously that resonated with me. And then when I connected with him, it was pretty funny because he's like, oh, I'm already talking with your chief nobody, Mark McNally. And I'm also talking to Barry O'Reilly, your chief incubation officer. And I was like, I love when that happens. All of a sudden, when like mutual passion and synergy start to intersect with one another. So that was kind of cool.
Well, Matthew's great in terms of his, thought leadership and how he's thinking about this space. And when you sent those questions to me, it was really fun because you're like, I've been here for a while and I'm an investor and I'm a executive, but I'm not sure I can answer all of these questions. And so I just thought that, Matthew's questions he posted out there last week were a great, place to start, this week.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm definitely going to ask you a couple of the questions that were on his list. And I suggest to people, if you're interested, definitely follow him. He puts out some really great content, I noticed. But one of the questions that he had included, Mark, was really interesting to me, about having structured checklists, right? And why that's important for any venture studio, because you want to streamline your operations, right? So that you could build the compelling companies with speed, like we're trying to do. We're trying to build 100 companies in 5 years. So we need to get really good about how do we do this quickly and efficiently, right? And so give us some advice from your experience. What are some of the checklists that, every studio should consider including in their tool, in their toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. Every studio is going to have their own vision and their own strategy, right? But then working backwards from that, making sure you have your checklist to actually support that, or to me, is very important. Mm-hmm. So we have it in terms of like, we've done stage gates and, time gates and capital gates. So we think a company should be in a certain spot, and that unlocks further investment, right? Or further, investment time and capital. And to know that you've gotten to the right spot, that's a checklist, right? I do think checklists are risky if you think that checklists themselves are the gating point, right? There's a lot of things that go into the gut. There's a lot of things that go into what you're feeling about the trajectory of a company. And checklists can definitely skew that the wrong way or not reflect that, right? So I do think it's important that checklists are a way to make sure you don't miss the obvious stuff that you want to do consistently, but there's something else that's harder to quantify.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with you. I think that you have to be adaptable, right? And flexible. So don't get too married to the checklist, but there are some things you absolutely have to check off, right? Like, for example, legal compliance checklist. This is something that, especially for a studio like us, when we've got teams, we've got investors, we've got stakeholders, located all over. So there are certain checklists that we want to make sure we have, for example, what we do with our comprehensive onboarding program, right? There are certain things when we're bringing new people in, we want to make sure they feel welcome and they get certain access to information. But legal compliance is another one. But also, again, I wanted to make sure we add on the intellectual property protection check, as part of the checklist as well, to make sure that you're protecting your intellectual property. So for a venture studio, to make sure that they're protecting their IP, that becomes really important. And so, we have Evalify, one of our NUCOs, which is really helping people with that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Evalify and why that's a good idea to have on any checklist, actually.
Yeah, I mean, just so, like you said, I'd say, first of all, checklists are to make sure you don't miss things, but they don't create things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Evalify is one of our companies we're super proud of. In a really short synopsis, I'll just say, imagine you invested in a company and 2 weeks later found out that 80% of the investment was going to pay an intellectual property claim. If that happens to you once, you're going to be like, how do I avoid this in the future? Right. I've actually been a part of that. Right. So I was part of an executive team that raised $22 million and $14 million went out to an IP claim from Amazon the third week I was on the job. And I'm sure I wanted to know that before. I'm sure the investors wanted to know that before. It became really, painful. So Valify we're all familiar with the idea of Carfax, right? Before you buy a used car, you buy a Carfax. It's, maintenance scheduled, if it's going to crashes, all the things you need to know, right? Carfax built themselves out of nowhere. Before that, you'd have to hire an attorney. You'd only do that if you're buying a Bentley, right? It's like no one was doing that for their used cars. And they created an entire industry, an entire market, where now you see Carfax reports on the cover of cars at every car dealership, and you would expect it as a buyer, right? So our thought was the same thing. How could you create the Carfax of IP? And that's what Evalify has done. And we're super proud of their early traction. They're in revenue. People love what they're doing. But think about this for a second. You can upload a single deck of what you're thinking about investing in or building, and you can get an immediate, assessment, a score, all of the competing, IP or patents that you might want to know about. It's a wealth of information in 60 seconds. $249 probably cost you 20 or 30 grand if you're lucky with your attorney.
Yeah, it's a game changer. It really is. And so again, I think it's important what you're saying is that, yes, you need to rely on your gut instinct and intuition because you've got years and years of experience. There's lessons you've learned. You don't want to repeat those, but you also need to make sure you have some structured checklists, and things like Evalify can really help you, especially as a venture studio, right? When you're trying to build, we're not trying to just build one startup. We're trying to build 100 startups. And so there are things that we want to make sure we get really good at and doing quickly to get the startup off the ground. And then we customize, right? You don't stick to these checklists. You got to tailor them to each startup that you create. So that being said, that really leads me to the next question is that, there are some common pitfalls that early stage venture studios may encounter. Right. And so Matthew mentioned a couple in his list, and I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on what you thought about these. One of the things he said was launching too many companies too quickly, and that's something that venture studios need to be careful of. So what are your thoughts on that? And I think of that as like quality over quantity. That's kind of how my 2 cents on that, but I'd love to hear from you on your opinions.
Yeah. I think we embrace the idea of learning in this process, right? I find myself conflicted on this question, right? Because I really believe that we have to strive to do a lot of companies, I believe that challenge and that goal means that we're going to hire the right people and we're going to build the right processes. And then you still need to slow down and make sure you build good companies along the way, right? So one of the reasons why, early on people ask me 100 companies in 5 years, that's crazy. It could be more rational. I'm like, well, that's the point. We're actually trying to make sure we scare away the wrong people, right? Investors, employees, whatever. If we're just trying to do what we've done in our previous career, but just a little bit more, that's not what we're here for. We personally are trying to do something bigger, which means you have to say, crap, if I'm going to deal with 20 companies at once, I have to think differently. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to break the mold and invent something new. And I think GPT came along, 3 years into our journey, but it's been a great, exclamation point to our thinking, right? Things are going to go faster. You're either building to be in that world or you're going to be in the other world, but there's no in between.
Yeah. So you kind of have to pick, right? It's almost like you have to decide.
And for us, making the bet of going big forces us to rethink how you build companies, how you make decisions, how you invest, how you fund. It's really a defining, theme.
No, and I totally, when I first joined the studio and I was starting to work on some of our culture strategies, it was really a challenging thing for me to think about. Okay, yes, this one strategy can work for a small team that we have right now, but when we've got 1,000 nobodies located in 55 different countries, what does this look like? And honestly, I'd never thought like that before. When I counsel clients or I work with teams, I'm looking at what they're working with right then and there and how can we help you do this right. But
Right.
then thinking forward like that, it really does challenge you. And so, I think, yeah.
Right. So it wasn't theoretical anymore, right? You've seen it as we've grown.
Right.
You watch how many conversations you're in and how many different time zones and different backgrounds and different everything, right? So you asked me early on when I recruited you, why the heck are you trying to recruit a culture officer when you're 1 day old and you're still in the garage? I told you, because we're going to grow phenomenally fast. And if we don't get culture right, we can't get anything right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, and we're aligned on that, right? I totally agree with you on that. And so that's one of the things that we, when we talk about structured checklists, right? Getting culture right is one of those things that often gets overlooked by a lot of companies because they're like, oh, we're not big enough yet. We don't have the team. We don't have the resources. We don't have the funding yet. We'll deal with that. And that's why I was very inspired and intrigued about what you were doing because you were thinking about it way back then when you were just getting off the ground. And so a couple other things that Matthew mentioned about challenges that venture studios might face. He talked about pursuing opportunities that are not aligned with follow-on investor interests. And he talked about setting impractical timelines for raising follow-up funding. What are your thoughts on those two things?
Well, those are two very different questions. Give me the first one again.
Pursuing opportunities that are not aligned with follow-on investor interests.
Well, I'll go back to what I think we've done well is we gravitate to our core values and like what we intend to do and what we stand for. And so if we bet on a company, you're going to hear passion. You're going to hear conviction, right? And so we only tend to create companies where that's a strength. It's not an academic exercise. Like, this would be a cool business. Let's build that. No, we don't do that. You're only going to hear people who are, passionately involved in something. And that tends to breed, repetitive support. So as you build your investor support, for an idea. Those are people who like what you're doing. Some people are early. That usually translates to people who want to support something later stage. But again, I do believe you have to double down on your core values and make sure that your why is strong enough, right? What was the second question?
And then it was setting impractical timelines for raising the follow-up funding.
Yeah, I think, and actually, respect Matthew a lot. I'd love to talk that out with him to debate what that means. I would say that many times we as founders expect money to come easier than it comes.
Yeah.
Right. And we get that wrong, and that hurts. So if that's what he means, I would agree. However, I'd also say that is actually what the startup game is all about. You have to rise above. You have to be the one that finds the capital. Like, you have to be the one that figures it out a way, right?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even say unrealistic timeframes on the capital raise is the problem. I think the biggest challenge for founders is knowing how to stagnate or structure their goals.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, this is what I'm doing right now. This is the capital I need right now. But we all as founders tend to think, this is what I'm going to build. And we talk about 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And that's not the same journey. The capital journey, the investor journey, the support you need along the way is a different journey. And I think that's something that, I've learned the hard way in my career. But I do think it's helpful for people to understand.
Yeah, and the way I read that was just, that you can see, like, and I've had some conversations with some, and not necessarily venture studio founders, but just startup founders, where they're not setting those realistic timelines, because maybe they don't have the experience, right? They don't have the knowledge of, or maybe they don't even know about the industry benchmarks, of what it would take to raise that kind of money. But yeah, I totally see what you're saying is you have to get really creative and learn how to move it along so that you can increase the chances of you getting that funding properly, right? And another good one he mentioned too is that, it could cause a lot of, it could be a big pitfall for a venture studio if it takes on too much equity, right? So that it's overly diluting and deterring maybe other potential investors to come in. So I think it's important to, like you said, lean into your core values, create those equity structures, and incentivize your founders proactively and have that kind of figured out. And I think it's also true. You got to consider alternative compensation models, right? Like, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go about the equity component of it. And I think for a venture studio, you have to kind of look at how many companies you're building, and there's so many things you probably have to consider. So yeah, that was a really a great slide that he had in his post. And then the other thing he talked about, which I would love to hear your thoughts on, is about leadership, recruiting the leaders for the venture studio. And so he talked about the question that was asked was, the CEO. What do we look at, when we're recruiting a CEO, or how do we evaluate a CEO to make sure that they're aligned with the venture studio's vision for the future? Any tips for people on what they should consider?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's like a, couple, bullet points on a, tip list, but, I think we've all learned as venture studio operators that, and we know, I knew going into this, the people we attract to the journey is everything, right? So I might not focus on CEO because I think CEO title changes over the course of a company's journey, right? So if something is Series B and it's going from $1 million in revenue to $100 million in revenue, you might want a different CEO, right? But I think co-founders are really important, and so maybe I'd change that question into the co-founder discussion. Mm-hmm. Co-founders are all about, one, you need to make sure there's a alignment in terms of their why. why are they doing something? Obviously, you need alignment on their skill set and their ability, but we all focus on that too much, I think. I do think you need to ask a lot, like, do they care about this? They want this to happen. What happens if it doesn't come to life? You know, there's a different level of kind of execution as a co-founder if you're really married to something versus you're doing it academically.
Yeah. I think when I was preparing for this, one of the things that I've seen with working with startups is this kind of overemphasis on how similar we are with the founder or CEO, you know, whoever they're recruiting for. And so focusing too much on these are the things we have in common. These are things that are, you know, rather than really looking at, you know, does this person bring diversity of thought to the table? Or are they just going to agree with everything that I say because we share these things in common? I think you really have to kind of look at that, right?
100%. And I think that what I always usually say the fallacy of interviewing as a startup person is in the early days, you're just super happy that anybody is still talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get more excited that someone with a background that's impressive is still talking to you. But all those things lead you to not hiring the right person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, we're in our own version of that right now. You know, we're 4.5 years into this. We've been really lucky to have some amazing people coalesce around the studio. But we are also in a spot where we need very specific talents and skill sets and backgrounds and conviction. And so we're interviewing differently because, you know, I represent not just all the founders and, you know, the future financial career of my life, my family, but I represent 1,100 investors, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I'm obligated to make these choices and evaluations, right? So we are in this spot where we all have to get in that right mix of, is there an alignment of personality? Is there an alignment of vision? Great. Is there alignment of skill set and execution and other things that matter? Yeah. You know, interviewing's been a thing for a long time. So we all have to be good at that.
Yeah. And I think this is a challenge for everybody, right, Mark? I mean, we're all sort of dealing with situations that we haven't dealt with before, right? And so one of the things I think is also important to what you were saying is making sure that is this person, do they have the ability to adapt, right, and grow with an evolving culture? That's kind of an important one. I think that gets overlooked sometimes because sometimes people are okay with the way things are, but what happens a year from now when things are different? Are you able to grow and adapt, right? And I'm a huge fan, and you've heard me say this to you, you know, is like, especially when you have the kind of experience and background that you do, relying on our gut feelings is a good thing in the sense of like noticing what the subjective impressions you're making about this person are. But I also am a huge fan of making sure you have a structured and objective process as well, right? You kind of need to find that balance. If you start doing, I just think this is a great person, you're only relying on the gut, that can backfire. But then if you're too stuck to an objective process, that can also limit some people or keep some people out. So it's about finding that sort of balance, right?
Yep.
All right, we got just a couple more questions for you here. This was something I was interested in because, again, last week I stepped into the shoes of a perspective of an investor looking to invest in Nobody Studios. But if we can kind of step back for a second, I wanted to ask you about just venture VCs, right? So venture capitalists that are looking to invest. And let's say they're considering, are they going to invest in this studio? Are they more likely to invest in a studio, like a venture studio like us? Or do you see that VCs are more likely to prefer or fund individual products that come from a venture studio? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, VCs is a broad category, right?
Yeah.
So it's really important to understand, you know, what VCs do and how the market's evolved, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, when I started my career, the average VC fund was $50 to $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big fund. And it was usually ran by 2 or 3 people who had built a technology company themselves and had an exit. VCs have become a financial instrument. And so that's evolved, right? So you'll actually see VC funds that have billions of dollars they can invest, but they're no longer ran, necessarily by people who've actually done something. So you actually see a lot of people, middle management, investment managers, managing directors, etc., who maybe had a little bit of startup experience, but you also see a lot of people in the early stages of evaluating companies that are fresh out of Yale or Harvard or wherever, right? And so this is not a critique. It's just the nature of what a VC is has evolved, right? The other thing that's happened, like I told you, it went from $100 million funds to billion-dollar funds. VCs have to deploy capital, right? Which is great if you hit their thesis, but they're having to make bigger bets on the same amount of companies, right? So if they used to invest in 10 companies, they're still investing in 10 companies. It's just instead of giving them $2 million, they're giving them $20 million. So all those things are changing the economics, which is one of the reasons why we are so passionate about our role in this marketplace. We don't believe we're the scale capital. We know that exists. We know VCs have that figured out. We believe our job is to figure out how to take an idea off the whiteboard and prove it. And if it's proven, we know it's fundable. So we actually see VCs as our brethren, right? Do we believe VCs know how to invest in studios? No. No, it's for a number of reasons. I think the narrative right now in the market has been there's like a VCs versus studios. And I'm on the record of saying I don't believe it's that way at all. If studios do their job right, they're building great companies that VCs want to invest in, right? But I think some VCs have reacted the wrong way and assumed that we're competitive. I think the other thing that we're getting wrong is people think that maybe VCs aren't investing in studios. I don't know. VCs aren't allowed to. If you're raising a venture capital fund, you're going to limited partners and you have a thesis and you're offering them ground rules. I'm going to do X because I'm a specialist in X. And limited partners give you the money to create your VC fund. It's really hard to later say, theoretically, I know I was good at this, but I'm betting on this other team. They're precluded from it, right? Even though investing in a studio is a great example, a great idea, can produce great results, they are actually precluded from it legally because they usually sign terms that say, I will not invest in another fund manager. And legally, we would categorize ourselves as another fund manager. We wouldn't, but legally we would be. So they get in this tricky spot where I don't think venture studios, for the most part, are getting much funding from venture capital firms, but it's not because they shouldn't. It's just usually legally not right.
Okay. And then just one last question that was popping into my mind when you were talking was, when you have a studio that has to balance, like some of the challenges you just talked about with VCs, they might be precluded from investing in a studio. So when a venture studio is looking to balance their investor interest, and then you've got multiple startups that you're building, right? Multiple companies that you're building within the venture studio. What are some things? I mean, when I think about what are some challenges that a venture studio would face, I just think about like how we always lean into our core values of transparency, right? I think that would be one way of managing the interest of the studio versus the interest of the investors. Is just lean back on your transparency and come back to again what you're trying to achieve. But what are your thoughts on that? Of what are some couple pieces of advice you have for a studio that's balancing those interests out?
Well, I think it's non-negotiable. We always lean into transparency. We always talk openly about things. I think your first question I'll latch onto. Companies that we create are completely fundable by venture capital firms. Like that's everything we said before is not precluding that, right? We're actually trying to build companies that are very attractive, have early validation, great teams, market validation, product validation. We actually doing what we're doing because we believe the market was going the wrong way, and doubling down on it had to be a unicorn or bust. And we're like, well, the market's kind of missing this idea that we can build, early high quality, high validated early stage companies, right? So that's what we're focused on. If we do that right, then the rest of the model works, right? We're feeding that into the system. Venture capitalists, investors, XYZ will fund those companies to grow because they've been proven. And that's makes our focus very, laser.
Yeah. Thank you. This conversation is resonating with people. Chris Gonzalez, shout out. Thank you for joining us today. And look, we had this conversation just last week where if you're interested in learning more about how the investment piece works with our studio, because every venture studio is going to be set up differently, right? And so go back and listen to our prior episodes. All of the live streams we've done for the Making Even Nobody are on our YouTube channel. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Mark. It was great to see you again. And I'll see you next week. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.